Hey guys, it's Dr. May. How's it going? Well, I hope you guys are doing good today because we have a good lesson coming up today for sensory motor psychotherapy. So this one, I hope you weren't freaked out by the title because it's some big words here. So we're talking about what they call directed mindfulness and neuroplasticity. All right, so not to fear, I'm going to explain what both of these things are. And the good thing about them is that once you're aware of what they are, it helps you to break long-standing patterns, especially patterns that developed in response to things such as trauma or attachment issues that we had growing up. So we could give us a possibility of living a better life now, okay? So some good tools for us today. All right, so I tried to find a graphic that kind of captured both the mindfulness and the neuroplasticity, which has to do with the brain. So we have a little meditating brain here for us today. All right, so let's get to it. So if you watched my previous video, which I hope you did because it's a foundational video, we talked about what they call the 5 building blocks of experience, okay? And as I mentioned in the previous video, these are going to be used pretty often throughout sensory motor psychotherapy. It's just like a concept that we could keep coming back to that could really benefit us. So the 5 building blocks of experience are basically how we could break down any kind of experience that we're currently having and different things that we could observe about it, right? So this includes our 5 sense perceptions, such as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, our thoughts, our emotions, our movements that we are making or would like to make, and our body sensations, okay? And these all cluster together, as you can see by the graphic and the way they are actually clustered together in the picture, okay? So here's the deal, right? So we have triggers in our life, right? Things that kind of trigger us to have a certain response, right? And some things trigger reactions that don't really mean much to us and it kind of just happens automatically and doesn't really bother us. But other triggers obviously are pretty painful and the response that we have is really getting in the way in our life, all right? And chances are that the current things that are bothering us are related to old stuff, right? So the thing it's triggering an old memory or it's triggering an old pattern, an old, bad feeling I had, an old problem I had. And it's leading me to have this pattern of these 5 building blocks that are coming up right now. All right. So our brains kind of like memorize these patterns and they all activate together in the same kind of a way each time we're triggered. Right. So if you think about, every time such and such happens, I tend to react this way. Right. That's what these patterns are all about. And if we really broke them down, we'd see that the building blocks are often kind of the same or similar. Okay. And these patterns may have been very adapted for us at a certain time in our life. But it could be that right now, if these patterns keep automatically coming up, they may not be adapted in the here and now, right? They might have been useful in the past, but not as much in the present, okay? So just a slight lighthearted view of this, right? So we all have patterns of reactions to different situations. So for example, we might have the afraid of abandonment cluster. So every time I'm in a situation where I think I might be abandoned by somebody or left by somebody, I have typical body sensations, thoughts, movements, emotions, 5 sense perceptions, and they all kind of cluster together, right? Or I might have the I'm not good enough cluster. And every time I feel ashamed or I feel like I'm not good enough, I have a certain pattern of reactions there. Or the how dare you cluster. So every time I get my back up about something, that might be a different pattern, right? So that one might involve a little bit more self-righteousness, a little bit more anger, a little bit more how dare you, right? Or I might have the feeling hopeless cluster. Like everything in my life is going wrong. Nothing's going to work out for me. I'm worthless. I'm hopeless. And when I get into that mode, that's a whole different cluster. See what I'm saying? Right. But the problem is like, how do we change this? Well, it actually is possible. All right. So one of the tools we can use to change these clusters is called directed mindfulness. Right. So if you look at the picture, it's like the arrow going directed to the center of the bullseye. Okay. So we can direct our attention, direct our mindfulness towards certain building blocks or aspects of building blocks in order to change the cluster. Okay. So we're going to talk today about how we can do that. All right. And by doing that, we can help further our personal therapeutic goals, such as moving toward wellness and a life worth living. All right. So, of course, we got to do a very brief review of what mindfulness is, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right. So, what is mindfulness? So, it's fully awake and embodied awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment. Okay. So, the patterns and clusters are activated in this present moment, even though situations might be reminding us of the past, right? So, the impact of the past is manifesting itself in the current moment and coming out as the building blocks, right? So I'm going to direct my attention on purpose to certain aspects of them, and that's going to shift my experience of the building blocks and also change my brain. All right, so that's the neuroception part. I'm sorry, the neuroplasticity part, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so there's two different ways we could use directed mindfulness. So one is to get to know the most familiar building blocks better. So if you think about it, when your building blocks are activated, you're not equally attentive to all of them, right? Some of them you may never have even noticed before, but some of them might be super prominent. So let's say I'm somebody that gets very wrapped up in my thoughts, right? So let's say my fear of abandonment cluster is triggered. And so I'm immediately saying to myself, I don't think I could survive by myself. This is going to be the worst thing ever if somebody leaves me because I can't survive by myself, right? And I'm obsessed with that thought. And that becomes the most prominent part of that cluster for me, okay? Someone else, it might be something different, but let's say for me, that's the most prominent thing. So if I use directed mindfulness in this situation, I could use it to just observe the thoughts that I'm having. I could step back from them and use my mindful awareness to look at those thoughts with curiosity instead of to just be wrapped up in them. So I could say, oh, there I go again. I'm having that thought that I'm not going to be able to survive by myself. Oh, the thought's coming back again. It's repeating again. Isn't that interesting? Well, there it goes again. Oh, it's saying I'm not going to be good enough alone. Oh, what's that all about, right? So I could step back and just observe and notice and get to know what my thoughts are doing. And just by doing that, it could even shift my experience of the thoughts and of the whole cluster. Okay, so by paying attention, that in itself has an effect. Another benefit of it is that it could slow down my automatic reactions. So let's say, normally speaking, when I start to think, no one's ever going to love me again, and I'm going to be by myself forever, and I can't survive on my own, I start to get more agitated. I'm a little bit moving. I'm moving a little bit more. I feel like, blurting out things. I feel more like my heart is racing. I start to act on ways to make that calm down. I start to do rash things, target behaviors perhaps, to calm down all those things that are activating because of my thoughts, because I'm believing my thoughts and I believe they're real and I'm wrapped up in them, right? So stepping back from my thoughts might interrupt that whole chain, because now I realize they're just thoughts and maybe there's another way to think about it. Okay, so next, second way of using directed mindfulness is by discovering different building blocks. Okay, so let's say we're starting out with the original example. So thoughts tend to be my most prominent building block, the one that I tend to gravitate toward and pay attention to the most. Okay, so to shift my experience of the cluster, I'm going to choose to focus on a different building block and put the other ones aside for a moment. So let's say I'm going to drop below my thoughts and just attend to my body sensations for a little while. Okay, so I might shift to feeling some of the anxiety in my body that came with the fear of being abandoned. So I'm feeling a shivery feeling in my chest. I feel like kind of a fluttery, a tingling. I feel my heart racing, and I'm just going to sit there and notice that the first most prominent body sensations that are coming up for me, and just stay with them without putting a story to it. I'm just going to stay with it. Okay. And doing that can then shift my experience of the other four building blocks. Another thing I can do is to shift my experience to a different aspect of that new building block. So let's say, instead of just focusing on the flutteriness of my chest and my heart racing, you know what? I never noticed that my feet are on the floor. What does that feel like? Or you know what? I didn't notice the feeling of my hair on my neck, or I didn't notice the feeling of my eyes blinking. Those are totally different things I would never have even paid attention to if I didn't decide to just do it on purpose. And so directing my mindfulness to that different aspect of the building block, which already exists, could change it. Okay, or I could even create a new body sensation on purpose, and that could shift my experience of the building block. So let's say I decided to rub my hands together, and put my hands on my face and just feel the warmth for a minute. That could create a different experience. All right, so you see what I'm saying? So there's different ways of working with the different building blocks that could then shift our pattern. All right, now, so here's for the big N word. So don't worry about it. It's not a big word. Well, it is a big word, but it's not that bad. We're gonna break it down. So if you look at the box on the left, right, we're gonna break up the word neuroplasticity. So neuro refers to our nervous system, which is our brain, our neurons, which are the nerve cells, spinal cord, right? The center of our thinking, right? Plastic means that it's changeable and malleable. So it means that our brains have the ability to change, okay? So how do our brains change? Well, our brains are constantly changing in response to our environment, right? So every time we're interacting with people, every time we're in a different setting, our brains are making subtle changes to help us better adapt to the environment, right? Because our brain's trying to help us survive, right? When we were growing up, our brains made certain changes to help us to adapt to the family we grew up in or to the circumstances we were in. And luckily, our brains continue to change throughout our life. So we could do certain things on purpose to help our brains change and adapt in a more positive direction. And guess what one of those ways is? Wait for it. Mindfulness, right? So mindfulness is actually one of the healthiest things we could do to positively change our brain. So in this exercise today, we're using directed mindfulness to direct our attention on purpose to certain building blocks and therefore make changes in our brain's patterning of those 5 building block clusters. Okay, see how that goes? All right, so let's just put it all together to inspire us even more for directed mindfulness, okay? So let's go over the benefits. 1, gives us a greater sense of agency and choice, right? So once I'm aware, now I could choose to respond a little differently, right? I'm not gonna just be a slave to my building blocks and my patterns. Now that I'm noticing, I can make subtle shifts, okay? Interrupts old patterns and creates new experiences, obviously. Supports expression and resolution of emotional triggers. Because emotions are part of that cluster. And once you change other things, you also change your emotions, okay? And, emotional triggers. So the triggers don't become triggering in the same kind of way. The response could become different once you work with the cluster, okay? And of course, as I just said, promotes neuroplasticity, so changes in our brain, and positive structural changes in our brain, all right? So for example, it helps our prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, get a little bit more active. It helps the limbic system in our brain, the emotional part, get a little bit calmer, right? So things like that are pretty useful. All right, so here's an important tip. So as usual, we have to do it. We can't just think it, okay? So it's good to know this concept, right? We have to start with knowing what it is, but we actually have to put into action and do it repetitively. So our brains need repetition to change. They can't just change in a one-shot deal, unless it's something really extreme, right? So we have to change the patterns we have with the clusters, to change where we do our directed mindfulness over and over and over again, right? Because we practice the old way probably through most of our life. So our brains had a lot of practice at the old way, the old cluster. So we need to then repeat and practice new changes to the cluster so that we have a new effect. Okay, so just to be fair, it takes time, right? You can't just try it once and say, it's not good, it's not working, right? It's like doing one jumping jack and saying, okay, I'm not in shape yet, screw this, right? Okay, we gotta be patient. Okay, so got some exercises for you. Now, I'll give you a little warning. So these are from the book, and some of them seem a little bit complicated, okay? So I did give a few examples just to make it seem a little less complicated, but you might benefit more if you write them down, okay? So if you want to pause the video, get a pen and paper, it kind of makes more sense if you just do it step by step and you kind of know what the steps are and you write them, okay? Trying to memorize them, it sounds like a little kooky. All right, so enough about that. So here we go. So first, this exercise is called changing negative beliefs. All right, who wants to change negative beliefs? Me. Okay, so here we go. So let's start at number 1. I numbered these. So 1, we have to just identify one of the negative beliefs we tend to have, okay? Or negative thoughts, whatever you'd like to call it. So then we're gonna follow this red arrow here and notice what happens in our body when we think that negative thought. So practice thinking the negative thought for a little bit and notice what happens in your body. So here we're going to particularly focus on the automatic movements that we are making or want to make. Okay, then we're going to flip it around and try to do the opposite movement. So we're going to change that building block on purpose and then see what happens to the rest of the building blocks. Okay, so here's an example. So let's say one of my negative beliefs is that people always try to take advantage of me. Right? Maybe that's been my experience for a long time. And I just go through the world thinking, people are always out to get me. They're always trying to take advantage of me. So when I think that thought and really stay with it, I realize all of a sudden my arms are folded across my chest and my shoulders are a little hunched, right? So this is kind of a self-protective posture, which probably made sense for me to have, right? Especially if people are taking advantage of me. It's like protecting my core, right? So that's my automatic movement. So let's say, you know what? All right, I'm going to try the opposite movement. So what's that? So I'm going to put my arms down by my side and roll my shoulders back so that I'm sitting up straighter. So I'm not protecting, I'm a little bit more open. And I'm going to stay with that movement, with that posture a little while, and then notice what happens to my building blocks. So for example, let's say I stood like this for a while, and now my body sensations are, I feel a little more solid in my back, right? So I'm standing straighter, my back feels a little more solid, and that feels good to me. So I feel a little stronger. So I'm sensing the strength that I didn't sense before. And my 5 senses, I notice that I'm a little bit more alert and looking around the room, and I'm noticing more things in my environment. Whereas before, I was a little bit more wary and maybe focusing only on threats. So now I'm a little bit more open with my perceptions. Maybe with this new posture, I feel a little bit more confident and capable. Oh, I do feel a little stronger. Maybe I can handle this. Maybe I'm not as vulnerable as I thought. Maybe it's starting to occur to me that it could be a little different, right? And so I'm thinking, I mixed the feelings and the thinkings. The emotions were maybe confident and capable. Thoughts were maybe I could take care of myself. And maybe I could be more proactive. I don't have to just sit by passively and let people take advantage of me. So this new movement gave me a new possibility with other things, right? So that's an example of how this can work. Okay, so this is another exercise called creating new patterns, right? So as we talked about before, we have different patterns in response to triggers, and we could create new patterns, okay? So first, you just got to identify a pattern that you believe you have that you would like to change. So think about like, what's your trigger and the automatic cluster that happens, okay? So identify the building blocks in the cluster that go along with the unwanted pattern. So when you think about being triggered in that certain way, what then happens to your building blocks, typically? So use your mindfulness, directed mindfulness, to observe the building blocks with curiosity. So just go one by one. You can go through all 5. So you're just going to understand them better. All right, so then you're going to use directed mindfulness to notice different aspects of the building blocks than you noticed before. So broaden your view a little bit and maybe notice some different things that are popping out to you now that you're looking more carefully. And then pick one of those things and say, you know what, that thing in particular helped me feel that it could create a new experience for me. So I'm going to practice repeating that more, that particular building block aspect more on purpose in the future to help me create a new experience. All right, so see how this sounds a little confusing? So I'm going to give you an example. Okay, so let's say the pattern I want to change is every time someone says something to me that I perceive as critical, I shut down. Okay, maybe I grew up and I was criticized by my parents or my teachers, and so my response back then was to shut down. And my response now is to shut down, right? Because I've memorized that pattern of response. So what happens with my building blocks? Let's say 5% perceptions. I look at the critical person's facial expression and focus on their tone of voice. And then maybe I look at the floor, right? So I'm zeroed in on the threat from that person, but then I kind of shut down and I look away and I maybe block out some 5 sense perceptions, right? I'm starting to have automatic thoughts that I'm not good enough. Or maybe I'm obsessing about the negative thing the person says, and I repeat that over and over in my head. What happens to my emotions when I'm shut down and I'm starting to feel shame. I'm starting to feel hopelessness. Like they must think I'm not good enough, so maybe I'm not good enough. My movements, maybe I'm shutting down, so my movements start to get slow. They're still, I'm slouching. Maybe my head's down, you know? So after I zero in the threat, maybe I just kind of withdraw a little bit. My body sensations, maybe I'm more numb, I'm heavy, my breath is shallow, I'm noticing these kinds of things, right? So all that cluster might be happening, you know, after I feel criticized. It might happen automatically instantly, or it might like slowly get to there. So I'm going to use directed mindfulness to observe these things with curiosity, without judging them, just noticing what these happen to be. Okay, oh, this is a pattern I happen to develop. This is what my brain learned to do when I'm criticized. Huh, maybe that helped me adapt. Interesting. Okay. All right, so next, we're going to use directed mindfulness to notice different aspects of the building blocks to create a new experience. All right, so let's go through them again. So 5 sense perceptions. So maybe I'm going to look for moments in the conversation when the person looked at me kindly or maybe smiled. Maybe the criticism was one tiny piece of the conversation and I saw that and then I blocked everything else out. But what if I opened my eyes to the rest of the conversation and I saw some kindness in the person that I missed before, right? Or maybe the person said other things. They said, you know, I didn't like the way you did A, but B, C, and D were good. And I couldn't take in the good before, but maybe now I can, right? Maybe now it's only fair to listen to the whole thing, okay? Instead of just being like, oh my God, I can't listen to anymore. It's probably gonna be terrible, okay? So 5 sense perception, I'm opening up my senses to more. Body sensations. So maybe before I was focused more on, you know, feeling numb and heavy, but now I'm feeling my feet on the ground and the strength in my legs when I feel my feet on the ground and the support of the earth, okay? Movements. All right, what if I were to lengthen my spine and lift my chin? All right, kind of like that first example. That's a really powerful movement. That's why I repeated it. What if I started to think, you know, there's more to life than this one painful moment. It doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't have to be the only thing that's ever going to happen to me and has ever happened to me. Maybe now that I'm seeing more broadly, I could handle it. You know, maybe there's more to that. And maybe I'm still feeling a little shame because it didn't completely go away. It's still left over, but maybe there's a little more hope. Maybe, you know, I'm feeling like this isn't the end of the world, so I'm a little more hopeful now. All right, so this is different aspects of the building blocks that I could try to activate to create a new experience, okay? But let's say I'm saying, all right, so in the future, which one of these were the most powerful for me? And so if I were to pick one, let's say I felt that the thing that worked the best was sitting up straighter. You know, just sitting up straighter when I felt down helped to activate those other more positive building blocks. So I'm just going to keep in my mind that if I feel criticized or I feel shame, I'm going to just sit up straighter and see what happens. And I'm going to practice that movement over and over and over again, and then create a new pattern for myself. Okay? All right, hope that kind of made sense. I know there's like a lot of components to this thing. Okay, here's the next exercise. Harnessing neuroplasticity, changes in your brain, for positive change, right? Harnessing the fact that our brains can change so we can make a positive change in our life. All right, so here's 2 things we can reflect on. So on the negative side, why don't we reflect on things that have not gone well in our life, right? Probably isn't too hard to think of that, right? So once you think about that, you know, think about those times, put yourself there, then identify the negative thoughts, or probably just thoughts, but probably negative thoughts, and body sensations that come along with it, okay? So that's, you know, part of the cluster there. Next, let's flip it around to the positive and think about some things that have actually gone well in our life, all right? Even if you're feeling down now and depressed, chances are there have been times in your life where things did go well, okay? So try to zero in on them, even if they're small, stay with it, and then see which thoughts and body sensations come up for you there, okay? So once you identify what those thoughts and body sensations are, try to say, you know what? Can I repeat those in the future to create more positivity, right? So when I think about a positive time I had, maybe some of the things I had was, wow, I could really accomplish something. What if I were to remember that thought at another time on purpose and say, you know what? I really can accomplish something when I put my mind to it. That might give me a boost and affect other things in my life. Or let's say, as I recall it, I take a deep breath and I feel kind of a relaxation and warmth in my body. And I say, you know what? I could harness that in the future. I could take a deep healing breath and maybe settle my nervous system a little bit more and feel a little bit more confident. And that could be a tool I could repeat in the future, right? So just those memories and the reactions to the memories can give you ideas for other stuff in the future that you could do on purpose. Good, right? Okay, so here's another complex exercise with a lot of little steps, but I'll give an example after this. Okay, so first we're going to identify the current problem that we're having. So let's say today I'm experiencing a certain stressor. What's that current problem that I'm dealing with right now? Okay, so while I'm in this problem, I'm going to try to identify my 5 building blocks. Okay, then after I do that, I'm going to try to direct my mindfulness toward a different building block or aspect of a building block that could change my experience in a positive way. All right, so a little similar to the other one. So we have a mystery building block here because it could be whatever you like. All right, so we're going to, for a little while, just spend a few minutes only focusing on that new positive resourcing building block instead of the problem that you're currently having. So just stay with it. Try to, and if your mind wanders back to the problem, just bring it back to the building block and try to stay with it. Okay. So after doing that, see if the rest of the building blocks start to change. Okay. It's kind of like the exercise we did in another lesson where, we had a stressor, we focused on one of our 5 sense perceptions, and then we went back to the building blocks of the stressor and see what happens. It's a little bit like that. All right. So then step 6 on the bottom there. So now after you focus on that healing building block, think about your problem again with that healing building block and see what happens. Okay. Now, let's do an example. Okay, so current problem I'm experiencing. So let's say, I'm talking to my boyfriend and he doesn't appear to be listening. Okay, so my immediate thoughts are, that's not fair. I always listen to him. How dare you? Why aren't you listening to me? I deserve respect, damn it. Something like that, right? So with those thoughts, my emotions are becoming frustration and anger, right? My movements, I'm starting to get a little more aroused and activated. So I'm maybe fidgeting, I'm like slamming things a little bit, I'm stomping a little when I walk, I feel a little bit more psychomotor agitation, right? So body sensations, I check in, maybe I'm like feeling my heart racing, the blood pumping, the heat in my chest because I'm kind of aroused, right? 5 sense perception, maybe I'm zeroed in on his lack of eye contact or the way his voice sounded, or maybe the fact that he's holding and staring at his cell phone, and like my 5 sense perceptions are wrapped up with that. Okay, so now use my directed mindfulness toward a different building block that could change my experience in a positive way. How could that happen? How is that possible? Well, maybe it is possible. All right, so let's say I chose to focus on movement, the building block. And so I'm going to shift my movement by sitting down and focusing on my breath moving in and out. All right, so instead of fidgeting and slamming around, I'm just going to sit for a minute and just go back to my breath. Okay, so spend a few minutes directing my mindful attention to this building block, focusing on my breath instead of my problem. So if my problem with my boyfriend not listening to me comes up, I'm going to redirect my attention back to my breath. Okay, now, okay, let's go back to the building blocks. What happens to my other building blocks now? So now that I breathed and paid attention to my breath for a few minutes, what happened? Okay, so movements I'm noticing, I'm just noticing my chest rising and falling. Okay, noticing my heart beating, my hands on my thighs. All right, so I still feel my heart going. Maybe I'm still a little aroused, but my hands are settled on my thighs and that feels pretty good. I feel the warmth, the pressure of that. Maybe I went past the anger thought and now I'm to a different thought. So now that I'm settling down, I'm thinking, what if his not paying attention to me means he's eventually going to leave? So that's the fear that's driving the anger. So maybe my emotion is fear because I'm afraid of abandonment. So that's the emotion I reached for beyond the first emotion, right? Okay. So think about your problem again while being mindful of the positive building block. So I'll allow myself to think of what just happened with my boyfriend. I perceived that he wasn't listening to me, but at the same time, I'm going to sit there and be mindful of my breath. So maybe my thoughts now are, maybe I'm overreacting because this is bringing up old stuff, right? Maybe I've always had abandonment issues. And that's why I was so angry. And that's why I became fearful. Okay. So now that I'm realizing that and having this insight, I'm experiencing some compassion for him and myself. He was just probably watching on his phone. He wasn't thinking about anything. He wasn't going to leave me. He was just doing his thing, right? Maybe I feel a little regretful because I overreacted. Okay, so now maybe my urge to movement's a little different. So maybe now I want to approach him, but not in a demanding way, but more in like, a calmer, gentle way. Maybe I want to apologize for overreacting, or maybe I want to be a little gentler in my approach and a little bit more like, all right, if you're busy, you're busy, but maybe later we could talk. So now my body sensations are settling a little bit. Maybe I feel my body relax and get a little cooler rather than overheated, a little softer in my muscles, right? So different things are starting to shift, okay? So that's kind of the idea of directed mindfulness. All right, so that's the end of that. I hope I didn't bombard you with too much. It is a lot of material today, right? But stick with the key concepts. You don't have to memorize all of this, but just the idea of pay attention to something different, and then you could get a different result, okay? You can help shift your pattern. All right, thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see you next time. All right, have a good one. See you soon.